Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Schubert, chair at Tarpeia, and today I will be speaking with Dr. Joseph Hall-Patton on his work in the field of American history and education. We'll be looking at the research and analysis he has contributed to, particularly regarding violence in the Southwest, and his efforts to broaden history literacy, both as a teacher and a scholar on platforms such as YouTube. Dr. Hall-Patton, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Could you just briefly introduce yourself beyond what I just said and give an overview of what you've done, what you're currently doing, and where the audience can find your work?
I am currently an adjunct professor at the University of New Mexico. I study American violence in the Southwest during the frontier period, which I define as 1848 to 1919. So, that's kind of the stuff that Hollywood used to love to talk about with their Western genre, but the reality behind it and the meaning of that violence, what it represented, is always what I'm essentially looking for. Along the way, as I was getting my education, I started a YouTube channel literally on a dare, and have continued it for more than a decade now, called The Cynical Historian, which you can find just by searching that. It's The Cynical Historian. I go by Cypher on there as a pseudonym. I kept that pseudonym basically to differentiate myself from my father, and then I've just kind of kept it all along because it's become like part of the lore of the channel. And on there, I can cover all kinds of different stuff, from movie reviews to politically pertinent, very important historical topics, or just general stuff. Like today, I just released a video on the Great Awakenings, a series of religious revivals throughout U.S. history, and kind of discussing whether or not we're in one right now. I ultimately concluded no, but you can argue the other way around. So it covers a lot of different things, but the ultimate idea is to promote, as you said, historical literacy and get people thinking about history and how it affects their lives.
So your dissertation is on violence in the Southwest from 1848 to 1919. What spurred you to research and write on that specific topic, that time period as well? And were there other topics you were considering? And were you interested in this particular topic before you started working on your dissertation?
It comes from personal experience that in order to pay for my education, I joined the U.S. Army, and I ended up fighting in Afghanistan. When I started in undergrad, I was studying American small wars, as in these less than declared wars, but not quite to the level of like the Vietnam War, which is undeclared, but more small wars. My capstone was on the Russian intervention of 1918 and 1920, when the U.S. actually invaded Russia, an oft-forgotten war. But moving into graduate school, I found out that was a little too niche, and also military history is its own bugbear that has kind of a lack of new scholarship. A lot of military history is just kind of repeating the same old stories over and over again, and I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to study history and come up with novel ways of telling it. But I was also interested in local history. When I was going to my master's was at Cal Poly, which is San Luis Obispo, where I was born. And I'd gone to UNLV, which is where I grew up, in Las Vegas, Nevada. And those two things, my father is a local historian, my mother's a sociologist. So those two interests combined with the interest in American small wars to get American violence in the Southwest.
So your capstone was on the U.S. intervention into the communist revolution that was going on in Russia. That was during
Oh,
Wilson administration, right?
oh yeah, that's actually where I get my I came into the channel with a fervent hatred for Wilson. That was not something that uh, you know was part of the channel. It predates it. But the interesting thing is, I took because of timing requirements during that semester, I actually ended up writing about the British decision to intervene into the war, which was ultimately Woodrow Wilson's decision. He just kind of followed them. But yeah, so that capstone is looking at a bunch of British cabinet documents in that. So rather than the American decision. Although the American decision can be summed up in a singular document issued in April of 1918 by Wilson. It's called the Aide Memoire. And it pretty much just repeats a bunch of talking points from a few months prior with the British, and it was already completely outdated.
So I have a question of what violence is. Are there different types of violence that you talk about in your dissertation? And do these different types of violence have different impacts on the history and the culture of the Southwest?
Absolutely. So there's kind of three main divisions of when we talk about violence that three levels of violence you could think of. There's martial, social, and interpersonal violence. So martial violence is referring to the military. Whatever the military gets up to is obviously going to be martial. But that also gets to can have a blurry line between that and social violence, which is the hazy area between martial and interpersonal violence. Interpersonal violence, it's typical random murders, family violence such as wife beating and rape. Things that are kind of low-level crime. Social violence is when it reaches a social level. So it has a community, it is caused by the community itself. That could be lynchings, that could be riots, feuds. Here in the Southwest, we had a fairly unique form called filibustering. And yes, that is actually where you get the Senate term, but it's through a bunch of weird things. It just means land pirate. And essentially there were people who went south of the border and tried to capture bits of Mexico for themselves. That basically didn't happen elsewhere. So a fairly uniquely Southwestern form of violence. But feuds, lynchings, riots, those are all common throughout U.S. history and form that main subject of social violence. When I talk about violence, I'm mostly talking about social violence. And yeah, and it comes to the Southwest, there's a lot of reason for all three to have significant and lingering impacts on our history here. The Southwest was founded on violence, and during the frontier period, it was one of the most violent places on Earth. So that leaves an impact. A lot of places were founded by the elite class consolidated power through lynching or taking advantage of riots. There's feuds here that are really famous, like the Lincoln County War and stuff like that, where it is all about incorporating that region into the national body politic. And so how it became incorporated involved a great deal of violence.
In your dissertation, you asked the reader to ponder the cause and the meaning of violence. What, in your mind, is the cause of those different types of violences, particularly social violence, since that's what you focus on?
A historian that I take a great deal of inspiration from, named Richard Maxwell Brown, theorized this idea of the Great Western Civil War of incorporation, that there were these kinds of waves of violence that started off with racial incorporation, who was included or excluded within the American body politic. You have full exclusion for people like tribes or Chinese people, and then you have this kind of halfway marginalization with like Hispanics or Black people in the Southwest are a very different kind of history than in, say, the South or North. So the fight over who gets to be represented in our government was often decided by, election riots was a major thing. You'd have mass lynchings like what happened in Los Angeles in 1871, where that kind of started the Chinese must go movement with a bunch of lynchings. But that's the first step. Then you have the second step, which is control of land. That's where you get a lot of these kinds of feuds, like the Lincoln County War. Who gets to control basically the cattle business that was going towards Fort Stanton there, and it was a competition between two merchant firms. The Tunstall Group were later called the Regulators because they formed their own separate group of deputies, which included the famous Billy the Kid. And then there was the opposition, the more established group that was aligned with the more established power in New Mexico, called the Santa Fe Ring. And that group was called the House because it was being run out of one guy's house, which happened to be the biggest house in Lincoln. And trying to control who had what contracts with the local Fort Stanton. That trade was what, and who controlled what land was what brought on that entire feud. And so you have land-based violence. And then finally you get to the final stage, which is labor-based violence. These are, the famous things like the Ludlow Massacre, for instance, in 1914, where, you have a group of protesters setting up a camp in southern Colorado, and then literally getting machine gunned by local forces. It was actually part of a much larger war. There's a great book called Killing for Coal that talks about how this was like actually a big war. We tend to focus on the Ludlow Massacre, but there's a whole lot more to it. But the point is that there it's deciding who gets representation through labor. So it's all about being incorporated into the American body politic. You could say it's the cause, you could say it's an effect. In either case, that is the meaning of that violence.
Now, where does the violence committed by, say, Native Americans in retaliation and for their survival fit into? I would assume that would mostly fit in with social violence, but also the martial violence, and also the Mexicanos who are trying to maintain their dominance that they had lost after a large swath of Mexican territory was taken from the United States. Where do those two different types of violence fit in with that?
With Richard Maxwell Brown's whole Civil War of Incorporation, obviously within racial. And, that while, yes, it does often kind of go from social violence to martial violence. You see that a lot, especially in terms of Indian wars, where you have like some minor depredations from a tribe, and then suddenly the army gets called in to chastise is the term they like to use, is to chastise the tribe and basically put them in their place, and eventually they literally put them in their place by putting them on reservations and then chastising anyone who escaped. The That is clearly on the martial side of things, but it easily goes back to the social side of things when you start thinking about how much ranchers would just instantly start taking pot shots at any tribe that happened to pass by their herds and stuff like that. There's a long history of that, especially along the various immigrant trails, where, for instance, I was just reading about the Bear River massacre and what led to that, and it was Shoshones and Bannocks who had been dealing with a great deal of emigration. There'd been the Utah War just earlier, and they started raiding immigrant trains and committing a few massacres. One of the worst being the Utter massacre in what is now southern Idaho. And that's all kind of social violence. And then the U.S. Army shows up in 1863 and decides to really make sure that that Shoshones could not do this anymore. And so they march out with a few locals at their head, most famously a guy named Porter Rockwell, and he leads them to a few bands of Shoshones winter camp on the Bear River, and they proceed to massacre them. And they were mostly women and children that they were killing. There's disputed amounts of dead. But the people themselves gloated about having killed 250. So that tends to be the amount that is normally taken for granted. But they were gloating. They were actually saying, "We did a good thing. We killed 250 women and children." As Californians are apt, this was a group called the California Column. As Californians were very apt to do. They were still doing a genocide in California as well. So that all plays into the racial aspect of this war of incorporation, this idea we need to exclude Indians from the national body politic. In terms of Hispanics, on the other hand, it's a little bit more complicated. We have certain treaty obligations that make it so that it's actually illegal to racially differentiate between Americans and people of Mexican descent. So Hispanics could oftentimes are fairly white, so they could easily be mistaken as Anglo or whatever ethnicity, and they could be they often aren't. They're more mestizo is the term, as in having a some sort of Indian background. But that amount of mestizo doesn't really matter. It was when it comes to this war of incorporation, it was because partially we don't have a lot of pictures of these folks, so we can't actually tell how dark they are without pictures, unless it's like specifically stated. And often it wasn't. So a lot of the time it came down to land. A great example were the Las Gorras Blancas here in New Mexico, over in Las Vegas, New Mexico. They were a group that wanted to push for Las Vegas, New Mexico, to be seen as this group grant, as Mexico had done during the Mexican period. There were these land grants that were given to entire communities rather than individuals. And the U.S. just doesn't have the legal mechanism to make that work. And so it got split up into various plots, and there wasn't these community land holdings, which meant that people started fencing off different parts of the land grant, and so Las Gorras Blancas would come in and burn fences or cut them or whatever. There were a few murders, and they were possibly associated with a raft of assassinations in Santa Fe. Kind of hard to tell because they're just, as Richard Max Burrell Brown once said, assassination was a standard political tool in New Mexico. So it was, it's hard to tell which assassinations are associated with which group. But in either case, this is a distinctly Hispanic uprising trying to assert their old land rights, and actually they would lose. We don't have a way to, even to this day, to really make a community land grant possible. So instead, you have to form a corporation, and that a lot of acequias are these group water group irrigation ditches are ran like this, basically trying to keep that old Spanish heritage, but make it work within the American legal system.
So it sounds like it's not just a conflict between different national identities or cultural identities. There's also different legal systems that are fighting each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Obviously places like Nevada, for instance, just doesn't have that legal tradition of layered sovereignty where you have, even though it was technically within the Mexican cession, the batch of land ceded to the United States in 1848, there was no settlement there. There was nothing that could assert any kind of Mexican sovereignty. Instead, it was completely indigenous land. And while obviously there is that side of the conflict, the indigenous side of the conflict, when it came to Mexican layered sovereignty, it just didn't exist. So you get Mormons coming in, for instance, just basically being able to claim, we're the first ones here. Forget the indigenous people, but we're here. And then that becomes a source of conflict in and of itself, where you have the Utah War. And mind you, all of Nevada was part, well, not all of Nevada, but the northern part of Nevada was part of Utah at this point. So the Utah War involved Nevada. In fact, the first time a petition actually made it through the House and towards the Senate to create Nevada was in February of 1858, which is during the Utah War. And obviously that involves a great deal of violence, such as the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which the bullets used in that might have been mined from a place called Mount Potosi, which is in the Las Vegas area. Las Vegas, Nevada. So there's all kinds of links, but it's never so simple as, it's because of race, it's because of land, it's because of labor. It's this constantly fluid concept, but it all does eventually become part of this larger argument over who and what gets included or excluded within the American body politic. My dissertation advisor wrote that about the dissertation, basically making it into a phrase for the whole thing. What I was trying to convey with that name was that oftentimes when I was looking for and you can find this in the conclusion, is that oftentimes when I was searching for what kinds of violence is in any given region, I just searched the local newspaper for the words "great excitement." It was this kind of euphemism for social violence, essentially. It was that the excitement, the perturbation from the normal, everyday kind of interpersonal violence had gotten so immense that it had become great excitement. And so some sort of shooting affray had happened, and now the entire populace is involved. It was a euphemism that 19th and early 20th century Americans understood all too well to mean um, basically our historian's definition of social violence, this kind of community-related violence. So it wasn't an era. I just called the book the dissertation that.
But the term excitement was used by newspapers at the time.
Oh yeah, great excitement, especially. The point was great excitement because they talk about
Right.
excitement. There's a mining boom happening in California. There's much excitement over in California, but they always seem to use the term great excitement specifically in relation to violence.
Okay.
It seemed to just be one of those terms that kind of everybody understood what it meant, but you know nowadays we've kind of lost that meaning. And since the dissertation is all about finding the meaning behind this violence, it's a perfect metaphor for the whole idea that this was an excitement from some sort of major change happening within society.
And so that phrase, that euphemism of great excitement, do you think, I mean, it sounds like it did have an impact in mythicizing and creating a legend behind that conflict of incorporating the southwestern states? Like, oh, it's a great excitement. Well, people, find that as a positive thing, even though there's all these horrific things going on.
Yeah, I mean the mythologizing of the frontier Southwest is a very complicated topic, and while there's never one thing that leads to such mythologizing. The main thing was it was kind of our last frontier in the lower 48. And frontiers always lead to a great deal of violence. And violence is very easy to romanticize. Just think about any movie you've ever seen. Action becomes a kind of key part of the climax of that movie. Even things that are distinctly non-violent, like a romantic comedy, will often still have some sort of Chekhov's gun. So by nature of the Southwest being the last one to be romanticized, all the other stuff that came before it with things like every other frontier, which everywhere in the U.S. was a frontier at some point. That last opportunity to romanticize a frontier gets completely imparted on the Southwest. It also helps that California became kind of our cultural capital of the United States with Hollywood. And but that was actually because Westerns, not a lot of people like to think that Hollywood came about because they were trying to escape patent law or whatever BS. That's completely false. But they actually moved there for the weather, and very specifically to try to take advantage of it for Westerns, which was the most popular genre at the time in the 1900s and 19 teens. So that speaks to how popular the Western already was, rather than how it became popular. So yeah, that's a whole another thing. I don't really focus too much on how the Western myth developed. But great historian on that would be Richard Slotkin, who just actually wrote a book on on a whole bunch of just the entire American mythos. But the main thing is that there's always going to be a bit of romanticization, and it's kind of the last frontier for the United States, and therefore it became the locus of all previous romanticization.
So in your dissertation, you go into a little bit more detail on how the East wanted to transform the West to prepare it for incorporation. What exactly were the metrics of change used to determine if the transformation was complete enough for incorporation, for statehood?
Well, sometimes statehood wasn't even the marker of being fully incorporated. I mean, while it was for some states, such as Utah or Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, it wasn't for Nevada and California. Nevada arguably became a state way too early, and California needed to be a state. Like it makes sense why, but its frontier period did not end with 1850. Um, California experienced faster growth between 1848 and 1860 than any state or territory has ever experienced in U.S. history. And by consequence of that, it was still extremely violent and still having to negotiate what was counted as part of the American body politic. Hence the entire Chinese must go movement, for instance, which is 1870s through the 1890s. Chinese exclusion gets federal backing in the 1880s, but even that was actually fairly ineffective at exclusion. And by the time that we are creating the Border Patrol in 1924, it's basically taking over a group that was called the Chinese Riders, which were a batch of custom agents specifically riding along the border trying to catch illegal immigrants of Chinese descent. So there's one could argue that the entire Southwest really doesn't count as fully incorporated until 1919, when our violence basically becomes the same as the rest of the United States with the Red Scare. As opposed to literally just earlier that year, you had the end of the border war, which included California. And there'd still be border conflicts like the Escobar, Escalar. I'm mixing up that name. Forget a Mexican general who tried to take over in 1924 or something like that. And you had bullets going across the border then in the 20s, and that's in California. He made one. Not him. De la Huerta made his last attempt at a coup by driving from San Diego, and the San Diego sheriff ended it before it could even reach Baja California. So there's still lingering effects. The Ruby murders in southern Arizona still going on all the way into the mid 1920s, and that's border violence. And you could argue that there's still plenty of border violence there, and a frontier is anything if not a border.
The instances where the federal government, this martial violence, actually got in the way of social violence. Like there are instances where the federal government steps in to stop the violence. Now, if the violence was part of the change, part of the incorporation, part of removing a certain class or a certain group of people that really wouldn't fit in well with incorporation, why would the federal government want to stop that violence if it's to their benefit in that sense?
Well, for instance, a great example would be the Camp Grant massacre in 1871, southern Arizona, near Tucson. In fact, the first photograph of Tucson is actually of the trial of the people who led that massacre. So a group of local ranchers, had been dealing with Apache depredations for years. They'd been raiding and counter raiding, kind of just the typical background violence of frontier living. Um, and Apaches were particularly well known for their raiding, and so these ranchers would often just um, um, shoot on sight, essentially, uh, regardless. And so in 1871, after one particularly gruesome murder, they decided to go and raid a local batch of Apaches that were officially under the U.S. Army's protection, um, the near Camp Grant, hence why it's called the Camp Grant Massacre. And these ranchers got another tribe called the Tohono O'odham. It it looks it looks like it's spelled Owadam, um, with a D, but that D is actually pronounced with a TH, Owatham. Sometimes they're called Pimas. That's a name they don't like. But they were actually the main perpetrators, but they were led by a group of Hispanics, also known as vecinos, and four very very prominent white men. And they killed I believe it's I'm not remembering the number off the top of my head. It's like 80 if I'm I don't remember it off the top of my head, but they killed a substantial amount of Apaches. And considering that most of the men were actually out hunting when this happened, a great book on this is called Shadows at Dawn, and it's referring to the time at which this happened. The Americans, set up a perimeter up above the encampment and sent the Owathams through the valley so that they could shoot down, and the Owathams would do the dirty work. And they did this at dawn, hence the name. Great book. And what that really showed was that the army was trying to prevent this from happening. Hence why they actually sent them to actually tried to convict them for murder, and that's the first photograph of Tucson. Is during that murder trial. They all got acquitted, and instead of being repentant or anything along those lines, they formed the Arizona Historical Society. That's actually the origin of the Arizona Historical Society. It was originally called the Pioneer Club, but it was basically to whitewash their massacre, and they did so to put Apaches in their place. Of course, the army would eventually have to do exactly that, but it was with much more constraint than what Arizonans wanted.
Throughout your dissertation, you write about how a common contemporary source used by scholars such as yourself are newspapers of the time. And I know you mentioned some of the inaccuracies of using newspapers. So were there any instances in your research where such media were just outright factually wrong or over sensationalizing an event where you had to find more correct information from a reliable primary document like a government report?
Well, look, everything's going to have its own form of inaccuracy. Like, there's no such thing as a completely objective source. And every historian is not going to be completely objective either. That's something the field has largely rejected. That whole idea of objectivity, the whole field has largely rejected. But just because they make mistakes, they lie, they fabricate, they tell tall tales, they freaking, get stuff wrong, sometimes intentionally, doesn't mean that that source doesn't have some sort of use. You don't establish facts by just saying this newspaper said this and therefore it's true. You do it through a process called cross-verification, where you take multiple sources and try to establish a fact that way. Furthermore, not everything's about facts. A lot of it is about interpretation. And, when I'm trying to suss out the meaning of this violence, it doesn't really matter whether or not the newspaper is correct or not. It's their opinion that I'm looking for. So who cares whether or not their opinion is correct? That doesn't matter. And sometimes intentional fabrications tell their own story that is extremely useful. I mean, something I've been doing a bunch of research recently into the Mountain Meadows Massacre. When Mormons killed around 120 immigrants on the Southern Trail through near what is now St. George, and just massacred a bunch of immigrants. And this is something that the Latter-day Saints kind of denied for a very long time. They blamed one of their members and then excommunicated him, and then kind of went, it was all him. Guy named John D. Lee. But this starts a profusion of various takes on the massacre almost immediately. Los Angeles, as soon as they found out about it, there was another train that was following the Fancher Party. The Fancher Party is the one that got massacred. The Dukes train, on the other hand, was just behind it, to the point that that they could smell the corpses as they were going through, and the Mormons who were guiding them literally required them to stay inside their wagons, and then proceeded to rob them of most of their stuff as they made it into the Mojave Desert. So there's that too. So not only is the Duke's train arriving extremely poor, but they know what's happened already, and they're immediately stirring up trouble by reporting this. And then Los Angeles has a meeting, and this is in early November of 1857. The massacre happened on September 11th. Well, the final part of the massacre is a several-day affair. But the final part was September 11th, 1857. So about a month and a half, 2 months later, 2 months later, they're already, Los Angeles is already trying to organize a vigilance committee to go out and invade Utah. A month later, San Francisco has the same thing, except for they send a bunch of bills to Sacramento in order to make a official California militia to chastise Cedar City, which had been the main perpetrators, and bring the Mormons to heel, if not completely annex Utah. So, we're seeing major movement within months, and it's all driven by newspaper opinions that are just saying the wildest claims. They're saying that they scalped all the women and ate their chests and stuff like that. And it's obviously that didn't happen. But that's not the point. It's that they are saying this, that all this churn in terms of trying to, that California threatening to invade Utah happens. And this constant opinion making about this, and not just lying, but, exaggerations, and then, because there's a lot of mystery as to what actually happened. And you get people like Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens, who came through in 1861, and he's writing in in the Comstock, and he's famous for his tall tales and everything. And while he tries to he calls, in his account of this, he calls he keeps on using the term painted Indians, um, which is an which had become basically slang for saying that all these depredations, they actually aren't from local tribes, they're Mormons. And so it becomes this whole thing that like now everything can be blamed on Mormons, and if you're just going if you're just poo-pooing newspapers because they're biased and they tell wrong things and they fabricate and all that kind of stuff, then you don't get to tell that story of all this other stuff, and the that is important to understanding incorporation.
Yeah, I mostly focus on American Revolutionary history, and there's a lot of newspapers saying a lot of crazy things sometimes. So yeah, it's definitely not something that you should leave out.
Yeah, didn't Ben Franklin say that the Boston Massacre was like 30 people dead?
There were newspapers that over exaggerated, and then it was Paul Revere, that famous engraving of the Boston Massacre that was made by Paul Revere, and it shows like a little dog like in front. It's like, oh, that's the good guys, and then the evil British. In your dissertation, you talk about using both micro and macro history. Could you just quickly define those two and how we can integrate them to complement each other and cancel out their respective limitations? And what are their respective limitations?
So, micro history is referring. Well, let's start with macro history. That's easier to define. Macro history is looking at what Braudel, who wrote Mediterranean and ran the Annales School in France for a while, called the longue durée. This kind of deep time where history is no longer about individual characters because they're dead in a instead it's talking like there's this great chart in Mediterranean where it's charting bread prices over the course of a millennium, and like that's the thing about macro history, sometimes called the Annales School of History, is that you're looking at these long durées, things that are greater than any individual can affect. And so it's about how society itself changes over time rather than the individual actors within it. Microhistory is basically a reaction to that, going down to the individual and seeing what you can tease out about society from that one individual. A great example is The Cheese and the Worms. I'm forgetting his name, the author's name. And this Italian 16th Italian guy had a kind of wacky heresy, basically saying that like the earth formed like it was a ball of cheese and milk, and the worms are the angels. He was literate. He was a miller, and he had apparently been reading some stuff he wasn't allowed to. And there's even mentions of possibly getting stuff from a itinerant preacher who came through and was eventually executed, who was a early Unitarian, and I take great pride in having grown up as a Unitarian. But the that story is more about like, how did he come up with these ideas? Where did all these weird things come from? And the church tried to be so lenient with this guy. I mean, they gave him a minor penance the first time. Then the second time made him basically have to wear a dunce cap and go on a pilgrimage. For I think he had to wear it for like 2 years before he could go back to just wearing regular clothes. But eventually, third strike, they find using quite an American metaphor there. But the the third time, they're finally like, dude, we tried with you. All right, burn him. We'll burn the heresy out. But what makes it macro history is not just a local history, it's not just a biography, but it's really exploring where he's getting these ideas, how it's coming from all the different Reformation era heresies, theologies, or whatever you want to call them, that and how it could impact this one random miller in the Italian countryside. So the combination of those two things into macro history and micro history in my work is that I am looking at a spate of individual cases. Essentially, each chapter is a case study. So let's go with San Luis Obispo, the first one. The San Luis Obispo had a vigilante movement that, much like any county in California during that time, but instead of making it a story about how the vigilantes organized, worked, and what they saw themselves as, it's more about how the entirety of California basically supported vigilantism and how that ended up playing a crucial role in establishing violence as a means of asserting lawfulness, if you could call it that, throughout the Southwest. So it's kind of like the first case in a series, not kind of, literally, it's in the series that I do, and by looking at it as part of this larger story, but really drilling down on one specific instance, I'm trying to bridge that gap between macro and micro history.
Yeah, so you asked a really great question, and that's how does the macro impact the micro in the interesting instance of that one heretical person? Are there times or individual people who have a great impact on the macro, that pivot the macro, like the macro is going in one direction, and then a certain person or a small group of people pivot the macro into a different direction?
Oh, there you're talking about great man history, and this is a constant arguing point amongst historians, because there are individuals who do manage to rise above their conditions to the point that they are in fact the ones directing history. I mean, the classic example is Napoleon, who really took the entire French Revolution and bent it to his will. And really, eventually, the entire continent of Europe he bent to his will. And that drove much of history. So yeah, there's certainly examples of great men who do in fact change history according to their will. But it's also important to recognize the larger conditions that brought about somebody like Napoleon, and that's kind of the thing with all of these cases. Is I'm not really looking at any particular politicians or anything. They just kind of show up. I study a very specific period, and a classic thing within, especially amongst history tubers, is they love to focus on presidents. I couldn't tell you like a quarter of the presidents who were in charge during that time. That's not what I'm studying. They just kind of show up sometimes, and sometimes they are an antagonist, sometimes they're a protagonist, sometimes they're just an official doing official things that need to be officially done according to law. At that point, it's like, well, it's the law that matters, not the president. It's the when it comes to like these vigilantes in San Luis Obispo, they're very clearly going against the law. Lynching is murder. The thing is, they didn't see it that way. They saw it as reinstituting the law. That's why it's actually called a vigilance committee. That's where we get the word vigilante. And a vigilance committee was to encourage vigilance for the law. There had been a perceived lack of law, and by doing these lawless actions, literally murdering people, publicly murdering people, so that they could proclaim that they had reinstituted a law. In a way, they did. They did exactly that. They brought their will into fruition. But you have to look at the entire system in order to understand how they could do that. It's no longer about the individuals, but more about this entire American tradition of vigilantism. So I could tell you a lot about various individuals who were involved in the Vigilance Committee, but even on the executive committee of the Vigilance Committee, the kind of people who were making all the major decisions, I think I could only name 3 of them off the top of my head. One of which got kicked off of it because basically he couldn't be there because he was the sheriff.
Vigilante sheriff.
Yeah. So here's the other thing. He was very against the committee, even though he was on the executive committees. Sheriff Castro is his name. And he actually protested the committee, hence why he was kicked off of it. But funny enough, like as kind of like a clear instance of the community accepting the actions of the Vigilance Committee, they had erected a gallows very publicly right there at the edge of the mission there. If you're in San Luis Obispo, it was in Mission Plaza, right across the street from from what was then John Wilson's house, but is now the History Center, or the San Luis Obispo County Museum. Right across the street, so right there. And they left it there, and it was left there for years, to the point that Sheriff Castro hanged somebody from that gallows, but legally. That's kind of showing that the community accepted it. I also argue that the community fully accepted it when Castro complained that one of the jailhouse doors had gotten ruined because they hanged somebody from that as well, and kind of broke the door. And so the community paid for the replacement of the door.
Jeez. I mean, you see some of that going on in the Revolutionary period, where you have a lot of these towns form their own committees, and they actually declare independence before the Second Continental Congress did. So there's a lot of like local level action that then builds up to the more higher level politics. And although we like to view our founders, or at least some of us like to view the founders as great men, they were definitely riding on a movement. Is it the people who actuate the movement, or is it the movement who actuates the people? And it's a cycle, so I don't think that there's a clear answer. And I think that's why we have to incorporate both of those perspectives, looking top down, but also bottom up. I want to ask about the experience that you had actually doing the research. Did you have difficulty doing your research, or was it relatively easy for you to find everything that you wanted to?
Well, there was no special access that I had that laymen don't. While yes, it will, if they want to use like a university library, they will have to pay for a university library card. It's actually not that expensive. Like here at the Zimmerman Library at UNM, I believe for a non-student or faculty, it is like $10 per year, so it's not much. Um, Plus, normal library, non-academic library systems often have access to academic library systems, especially through interlibrary loan, and will have special things within their communities for that. There's all kinds of different ways of getting access to things where they do have, like a university library is meant for students and faculty, obviously, but they're not closed off to the public. Just have to pay some sort of fee. Because obviously students are paying for it. They just pay it through their student fees. Faculty aren't paying for it, but that's kind of comes with the perk of the job. Plus, it's very necessary. It's not a perk of the job; it's a necessity of the job. So in terms of local archives, you can have such a gambit on that. You can have like real easy time where I had like as much access as possible in San Luis Obispo, where they're like, hey, your dad organized all this stuff, so have at it. Like half the labels are literally in my dad's handwriting, so it's just like, yeah, whatever, you do it. And they were just happy that, like, for instance, on the vigilante papers, I'm the one who digitized them, and like, there's actually a missing box that they allowed me to go into that most people would not have access to, but because of my father, I was given access to where they have an off-site storage location in what's called Fort San Luis, and it is a military base and everything. But luckily, I'm also a veteran, so I could easily get on the base that way. And I got access to this thing to go rummaging around in this, basically, Indiana Jones style, freaking like, let's go find the Ark of the Covenant. I couldn't find it though. But that's because over the years those boxes have gotten moved around, and they once went to Cal Poly, and Cal Poly only records having 2 of them, but I know that they transferred 3 boxes to Cal Poly, so it might be sitting somewhere in a vault in Cal Poly, and I just didn't have access to that, even though I was a student at Cal Poly. And then there's ones that I had a little bit more difficulty with. For instance, I took a bus from Nogales down to Hermosillo, the state capital of Sonora, where they have an archive there, and the archivist, who I know for sure spoke fluent English, required me to go hire a translator, because I do not speak Spanish. I can read a bit of it, but I do not speak it. And and so like, she literally forced me to go outside and pay for an interpreter just because I'm an American, just basically to screw with me. I didn't even find much there about what I was researching. I was researching the Battle of Ambos Nogales, and it turns out that I probably would have had to go to Mexico City to do any kind of major research into state archives, because they've transferred everything that isn't 50 years old. Also, in Nogales, Sonora, their entire archive had been just like laid out, and they were basically reformatting it. So I found some documents, I took some pictures of them, but it was literally because I'm like walking around looking at just piles of paper everywhere, and it's just like, oh, I recognize that. That says 1980. That says freaking what was the date? I think it's August 30th, 1918, if I remember correctly. But I recognized the date, and it was like, oh, that's the Battle of Ambos Nogales. Let me get that piece of paper. But like, it's literally just a piece of paper and piles of stuff that they're like cataloging. So you get those kinds of issues. And then you get ones where they just don't want to give you access, like the Hermosillo one, or you have ones where they're just so badly disorganized that and it could be something like the microfilm archive for letters from various forts in there's an archive that goes all the way to 1918 that is all the letters written, all the letters, orders, just documents written for army posts, all. They had to be filed in triplicate, so we actually have a pretty good record of that. The problem is when they were turning them into microfiche back in the, I believe, the 1950s, a lot of these were relying on haphazard categorizations that they had just kind of thrown together and put them all in the box over here. Now we're going to put this box as the miscellaneous letters to the general. It's like, no. And then I found a bunch of them that I really needed to in that miscellaneous thing, but they weren't to, they were from, or no, they weren't from, they were to, and that's what I needed, and they were mislabeled, and I only found it at the last moment of just kind of like, what else could this possibly be? I know that these things are supposed to exist, and then I finally found it when I just started searching in places that they weren't supposed to be in. And so you run into a lot of that, where you have to have really creative research methods.
Yeah, you have to definitely be very open and exploratory when it comes to a lot of this archival material, because there's a lot of things that aren't really obvious, especially if you're doing a deep dive into a specific topic. And then there's a lot of things that are just totally not organized. I found a lot of anti-Federalist papers because I also like the early American era. And I found a lot of these Federalist paper essays as part of like a different section of the same magazine, the same newspaper as the Federalist Papers, as the Federalist Papers were originally published in newspapers. And so you have to read more than what you think you're supposed to read, because you can find so much more.
Yeah. And, especially when you're talking about like papers, a lot of that is digitized. And that's another weird stumbling block, because like I love keyword searching. Now that we can do it, but sometimes you got to get creative with those keyword searches because they're not properly OCR'd, or they're not. When you're talking about the 18th century, spelling is even more weird. And then there's stuff that's like handwritten, where being able to read 19th century handwriting is a skill in and of itself. So, in terms of layman getting access to these things, sometimes you will have to gain a skill such as being able to read 19th century handwriting, being able to speak another language, or in my case, read another language, not speak it. And I'm not particularly good at reading Spanish either. I have enough that I know exactly what I need to find, and then I can do the hard work of translating later.
Have you expanded on your research in the past 2 years since publishing your dissertation?
Oh, yeah. I started a new series on my YouTube channel that is essentially preparing for another chapter of my book. As I was talking about that whole Mountain Meadows massacre thing, I've also done a few episodes in preparation of that, where like I did a reaction, not a response to Johnny Harris, and then also a review of the Mormon Museum in Salt Lake City, and now I'm doing a series on the Latter-day Saint movement. I have 5 episodes planned. I'm currently writing the 4th. I've already made 2, released 1, and I have a third one recorded but not produced. So, yeah, and that will all feed into a chapter on the Mountain Meadows massacre.
What is this? I noticed recently a lot of YouTube historians are talking about Mormons. Is that your fault? Is that why? I don't know why.
You referring to the fact that Mr. Beat made an episode about it recently, and that is totally my fault. We were in Salt Lake City for a conference that I had organized a panel for it. And I brought Mr. Beat to be one of the speakers. And you could actually see in that episode, Matt and I was the cameraman for a lot of it, and then at one point I actually show up on camera to give a little spiel about the Mormon battalion, and you could tell that I am at that point I am not well versed in Mormon history yet, because I chose to only talk about the Mormon battalion, which was like the one thing I could bring up about California, because I just didn't know Mormon history at that point. I've had to do a bunch of research, and that was one clear piece of my dissertation that was missing, just a massive gap, a Utah-shaped gap in my dissertation.
Well, speaking of gaps in our knowledge, what are some areas of further exploration you would like to research, or maybe get some members of your audience to start investigating and learning?
Well, I'm adding 3 chapters to my book. The first one will be on Mount Meadows Massacre. Another one I know for sure is going to be the Los Angeles riot in 1871, or the Los Angeles anti-Chinese riot of 1871. Basically, I have to learn a bunch about the anti-Chinese movement, the Chinese must go movement. And so that's the next thing. And then the thing even further from that will be more on some sort of mind war. I don't know which. Could be Ludlow. Could be, but could be any number of things. I mean, I even thought about doing it's not really a mind war, but the Muscle Slough shootout, which which is where you get that great quote from Karl Marx, who says that Muscle Slough proves that California is at the head of incorporation into the American body politic. It's like, what? Karl Marx knew about all this. Why am I so late to this? Some freaking 19th century German is freaking paying attention to Southwestern incorporation? What? But the I don't know what I'll be doing for that last edition, but it needs to be something, and that'll finally fill in the gaps in my dissertation. Didn't talk about Chinese people whatsoever. Obviously, that's a clear form of exclusionary violence. Didn't talk about Mormons, and didn't talk about any major labor-related violence besides stuff that was like border-related. Like the Bisbee deportation, which is 1917, and Bisbee is just a few miles away from Nogales.
Yeah, you mentioned in your dissertation that exclusion of history. I think you used the phrase mutilated historicity.
Oh yeah, that's Marissa Fuentes is the one I'm quoting there, where she's talking about she was talking about the mutilated historicity of the archives in Barbados, and specifically how it excludes so much history about slaves, and intentionally so. Many of these documents existed and then went away. So that's really what the mutilated historicity is talking about, is what gets included in archives and what doesn't. Something that is a pretty instant way of making sure your story is not going to be properly included in an archive is to get murdered. And well, that's a lot of the people I talk about in this book, is a lot of people who got murdered. And how do you tell their story? They when their voice was violently stuffed out. That historicity has been mutilated.
Now, speaking of the victims of this kind of violence, you mentioned that you had suggested putting a noose over a monument to commemorate lynch victims in Slough.
Yeah.
Um, and I know that you said that it was rejected for tourist reasons, but could you explain the difference between commemorating victims and commemorating victors or people who commit the violence? And could they both mythicize violence and even encourage it in their own way? Like
Well,
what's that relationship between the two?
rather than commemoration, it should be memorialize. In
Right.
terms of Slough, yeah, they want to commemorate. They don't want to memorialize. That's
Right.
the difference. They should be memorializing their commemorating history. Two very different ways of looking at the past. One's openly triumphalist, one actually wants to try to understand the past. You can't have both. There, it was that they wanted to put another monument. There was these plaster cows that were being put throughout the county, basically to commemorate history, and they wanted to put another one in Mission Plaza, and it was going to be in the exact spot of the gallows. And I'm just like, yeah, just put a noose around its neck. That's exactly what should be there. Like, there is no memorial to this. Maybe shock and awe people in terms of the realizing that this place was built on violence. And obviously that's not commemoration, that's memorialization, and they don't want to do that. By denying that history, by not putting a memorial there of some sort, by refusing to talk about it in any kind of detail, say for in history books, and literally right next to there is Walter Murray's house, and they commemorate the heck out of that. And Walter Murray was on the executive committee of the Vigilance Committee. His house actually covered a chunk of where the gallows was, but most of it burnt down. Now it's basically just a shed. It is literally a storage shed, I should say, but it's a adobe storage shed. But that's actually a place I went looking for the vigilante documents at one point. But the most of it, that's only one part of it. Most of it is just like lawnmowers and that for the grass. But the point is, that's right there. So why can't they memorialize his victims? It's eventually, it's not about like whether or not it's going to create misconceptions or not. It's just about telling the truth. If you talk all about how Walter Murray was the founder of the San Luis Obispo Tribune, and he was an important lawyer during the tumultuous 1850s. They literally use the term tumultuous, and it's like even he called it the bloody 50s. But the when you sanitize that language and you exclude any mention of the Vigilance Committee, of the lynchings that he perpetrated, the various gunfights that happened around all that, the state support of the vigilantes through the San Luis Obispo Rangers and whatnot, and then the community support afterward, you are excising this huge and important chunk of that history. And the fact that nobody knows it if they're just visiting and haven't read a book is a pretty open, mutilated historicity.
Wrapping up this discussion of your dissertation, what is the connection between the violence of the Southwest incorporation and violence we see today, such as October 1st, 2017, apart from them both being violent?
The main connection with that I made was between that and a massacre that had happened in a place called El Dorado Canyon, which is about 50 miles south of Las Vegas. If you look up El Dorado Canyon isn't going to show up, but if you look up Nelson's Landing, that'll show up. It's a ghost town that's in there. And there was a massacre that happened there, perpetrated by a Paiute named Avote, who now it normally tallied to 5. I know for sure he killed 7 at least, and possibly another 3, though they're only listed as Mexican porters. So I don't have their names, and so I'm not going to count that as a death unless I know their names. But I have the names of 7 people who he killed, and that was all in one night. So it was essentially a mass shooting, or properly called a shooting spree, and that was in 1890, just south of Las Vegas. I don't draw a direct connection between between 1 October and Avote or any of the subsequent what were called renegade Indians. The renegades, they were you have Avote, Loco, Mwawich, Mouse, and most famously Keo. But what I do connect is with Keo, who basically got mummified and turned into this prop, and it really charts the development of Las Vegas as a culture and how that prop got used for a while, and then how it got chucked aside, and only to be buried in 1978. He died. He was only found in 1940. So 28 years of being a prop.
Do you have any last words before we end it?
Oh, always just never stop researching, never stop learning. Always, the history is the story of us, and that means that we're always writing new stuff, and we're always finding new stuff, and we're always learning from it. All this stuff about the Southwestern violence, it might seem distant, but for instance, California is the cultural capital of the U.S., and that means that everyone is indebted for their entire media landscape to this violence.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to do this interview, and I hope you and everyone in the audience have a good day.
Well, thanks for having me on.